I may not like mushrooms, but this Alteryx Weekly Challenge was a really fun one. So we've got a load of mushrooms here, which have been classified by all sorts of different characteristics or attributes. But this output isn't very useful to us right now because it requires us to use a lookup table all the time to know what is going on. So this is the information that we need to decode the dataset, but even that's not in a very useful format because it requires you to sort of manually read it. So what we want to do is sort of split this out into a nice table that can actually be used as a lookup table to join on to our dataset. So what we start by doing is, if you notice this first line here, it has attribute information and then a colon. And then our first field that we're interested in is the class field. And that's sort of after that attribute information. So we kind of want to get rid of this attribute information here, because that's almost like it should be on a separate line, because this classes should be its own attribute basically. So that's our first thing that we're going to do. We're going to use regex replace to get rid of that. And then we can see the data structure is basically the header that we see in the data set up here, and then a colon, and then each of the attributes is separated by a comma, and we see the sort of the code, the letter code, and the actual description of what that means, separated by an equal sign. So we'll want to first of all split everything up by the colon, then split into rows on the comma, and then split up by the equal sign. So first of all, we're getting rid of that attribute information here by using regex replace. So what we're doing here, if I kind of highlight that, so basically let's talk it through. So we start our first capture group, and that's how we're going to want to capture our attribute information. So we say .star question mark, which just means anything basically, anything up to a colon, which is what we have here. So that's that colon there, and then a space, and then an opening bracket. So that's what we want to get rid of. That's all of the text that we want to replace with nothing. So we've got our .star question mark, then a colon, then a \s, which is the space, then a / opening bracket, which is the opening bracket. And then we close off that first capture group. And then the rest of it we want to keep. So we just say a .star in that brackets, which just means anything after that, basically. And we're saying replace this expression with the second capture group. So only keep the second capture group. And that's what we're doing there. And we get rid of the attribute information. Naturally, that took me a little bit of playing around with to get the right syntax, but that would be boring to listen to, I'm sure. So next we're using regex again, just to split that into two fields. I could easily have used a text columns tool here, but I was playing around trying to do the two regex steps in one tool, but I couldn't make that work personally, so that's why it's still split into, that's why I'm using a regex tool here basically. It's because I was trying to do something clever and I couldn't. But it does have the benefit of using the regex tool over the text columns tool, that I can rename these headers within the tool itself rather than using a select tool afterwards. So just splitting that up into the headers and into the attributes. Now I can't stand all this red sort of glaring out at me saying not okay, so I'm going to use a data cleanse tool here just to make it all nice and green at the top there, because it just needs to be getting rid of those leading and trailing white spaces. So that's great, that's looking a lot nicer already. I'm using a select tool just to get rid of that first column. Not really a necessary step because we could do it later, but it just makes me feel happier sometimes to see it like that. So now we're using our text columns tool on the comma and splitting it to rows. So we're just saying split each of these attributes into its own separate rows. So then, for example, for classes, I get 2 rows where I've got the E for edible and the P for poisonous. Then I'm going to split up on the equals sign and get those in 2 separate columns. I'm just going to take away the unnecessary one, rename those fields to be helpful for us. So yeah, if I use the regex tool, I wouldn't have to do that step, but I'd still need to get rid of the other columns. So probably would still end up using 2 tools. Using the data cleanse tool again to get rid of the white spaces. And then you can see we've got a comma here on this P, so I'm just going to replace that with nothing, just using a simple replace formula. And then we see that up here it's called class, whereas down here it's called classes. So I'm just going to replace that with the word class rather than classes. I'm sure there's a more dynamic way to do it, but hey, this way works. So we've got that all nicely structured now to be able to join on to our dataset up here. So before we transpose all of this down from how it is currently, I'm going to put a record ID on it so that we can maintain the original, rows. Because otherwise, when we go to cross-tab it back later, it won't know how to separate onto different rows. So I add a record ID, and then I just transpose it down, everything except the record ID. And now I can just join on the name to the headers, the value to the code, and I can use my crosstab tool, grouping on that record ID, having the headers as the headers, and now having the attribute value as the value inside the columns, and just selecting concatenation as the way to aggregate. And now we see that we've got 8,124 rows. That's the same as before. So that's wonderful. And we have all the information kind of in here. All that's left to do now is to just manually rearrange the columns, which is a bit of a pain. I saw another suggested solution using dynamic replace tool, and that keeps the column ordering, but this wasn't too many columns. I thought it was fine to just do manually. And in most cases in the real world, you wouldn't really need to manually reorder because you're presumably going to be outputting to a database or loading it straight into something like Tableau. So the order of the columns is rarely kind of that important. But anyway, not too bad to do manually. I hope that was useful, and thanks for listening.